So we'll go ahead and get started because we've got a good chunk of people. So welcome everybody. This is one of our occasional Thinking Tuesdays, and we'll be talking about Jewish mysticism, and understanding is maybe more than we'll actually get to, but it seemed like a good place to start as a thought for what we'll sort of try to do. But like as usual, I have a set of learning goals at the beginning, and it's to understand on a basic level what mysticism is, because you may not have given it a lot of thought, or you may have thought about it, but what you've thought mysticism is might not actually be how at least the religious studies perspective on mysticism would have it be. And it's helpful to know that in order to have a lever in to what's happening when we see some of the very strange texts we're going to see. We'll learn a little bit about the schools or forms of Jewish mystical belief and practice, and we won't go in depth because you could go for days and days and days, right? There are people who've made their entire careers studying Jewish mysticism. We're not going to do that to ourselves. Understand the basic terminology most often associated with Jewish mystical belief and practice. And again, this is a relatively limited body of words and ideas because, again, PhDs are done on this. And then identify aspects of everyday Jewish life that have been affected by Jewish mysticism. And in the description to the program earlier on, I said we will also talk about how it plays into Humanistic Judaism. There is a professor he's emeritus at University of Haifa. He's now professor at Shalem College in Jerusalem. Menachem Kellner. Kellner is a scholar of Maimonides, and I was listening to a podcast that he was on earlier today, and he actually said, people don't understand how much of everyday Jewish life today, all across the spectrum, is touched on specifically by Kabbalah, by that particular form of Jewish mysticism. So we'll talk about how it affects Humanistic Judaism as well. Because if you don't know what to look for, you don't realize that the thing that you're looking at is actually Humanistic Judaism, is actually affected or brought to us by Jewish mysticism. So we'll start with what is mysticism anyway. And mysticism is a religious phenomenon. It's related to the word mystery from Greek mysterion, secret rite, related to the word mustes, one initiated. There will not be a quiz on this. I don't expect anybody here to know ancient Greek other than me. But we get a few different definitions if you go Googling around or Wikipedia-ing. The experience of mystical union or direct communication with ultimate reality as reported by mystics, right? So that's one way of defining mysticism, right? As the subjective experience of the person who says they are a mystic. Any experience of altered consciousness or ecstasy given religious or spiritual meaning. So this is having an experience. Maybe it's entirely mental, maybe there are chemicals involved, or you're stuck out in the wilderness and you're undernourished and you have heat stroke and you have an encounter, and then afterwards you kind of go, I saw God in the desert, right? We hear about people saying things like that, so that's another possible understanding of mysticism. Or claims of insight into hidden truths and transformative practices associated with such insight. If I was going to pick one that most closely connected to the way Jewish mysticism operates, it's probably the third one. Although all three of them apply to various specific experiences that you can read about. And then it says it's part of and even integral to many religious traditions, and it's nearly universal depending on how you define it. So Judaism has forms of mysticism, Islam has forms of mysticism, Christianity has forms of mysticism. You will hear certain kinds of Buddhism described as mysticism. You will hear some kinds of indigenous religious traditions defined as having mystical elements to it. So it is a nearly universal thing, right? There are religious studies scholars who study this transculturally. But mystical experiences are ultimately individual experiences. And the impression of the experience contributes to knowledge, right? So we understand Jewish mysticism to be a body of information and knowledge and of experiences, and people tend to have common experiences as Jewish mystics. When they're in community, they tend to have common experiences. They'll even talk about having shared communal mystical experiences. How much is that determined by just mysticism is a particular kind of experience mentally for people who have it? How much is determined by, well, we're all sharing a particular body of Jewish knowledge that we're coming into the experience with? These are really open questions, because you can't pop open somebody's head and see what's in there and what happened to them. But there are common threads across religious traditions, and there are common threads among specific Jewish mystics. Is it private or public? We tend to think of mystics as people who go out into the desert and have wild experiences, but that's not necessarily always true. So within lots of different pieces of religious text and canon and whatever else, Ezekiel's vision of the divine chariot in Ezekiel 1 is very frequently described as a mystical experience, and is one of the basic texts that comes to shape particularly early Jewish mysticism. So whether he had a mystical experience, or there are people who hypothesize that he just had a dissociative experience, there are people who think he had mushrooms. There's all kinds of, one way or the other, this forms a core text for early Jewish mysticism. Depending on how you view apocalyptic texts, the second half of the book of Daniel in the Hebrew Bible and the book of Revelation in the New Testament are potentially both candidates for mystical experiences. Meditative moments in many different world religious and wisdom traditions, right? People describe reaching kind of transcendent moments and experiences of ultimate reality and apprehension of the really real in all kinds of different meditative traditions and moments, and so those are frequently also thought of as being mystical. But there are communal examples. So Ezekiel's vision of the divine chariot, Ezekiel says he's in the temple, but no one else sees what he sees, right? And he describes this very, very wacky vision of a chariot, and there's feet and wheels and faces that move four ways, and things can move and not move, and it's trippy. I guess if you were to try to make art from it, it would be very trippy looking art. But there are communal mystical experiences, and we get the word mysticism essentially from this first one, the Eleusinian Mysteries, which were a set of rituals connected to the goddesses Demeter and Persephone in Greek culture. And there were multiple levels of initiation into the mysteries, and they happened at the city of Eleusis, hence the name Eleusinian Mysteries. And there was a specific drink that was given to almost everyone who participated, and there are hypotheses that this was some kind of psychoactive compound in the drink that then caused people to have the same kind of ecstatic experiences. Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. Probably most of us might not know what I'm talking about when I say Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, so I'll explain it because that seems only fair. The book of Acts is the fifth book in the New Testament. It comes right after the four Gospels, and it's probably written by the same person who wrote the book of Luke. And the second chapter of Acts describes essentially Shavuot, right? So 50 days after Jesus's execution according to the Gospels. Acts says that the Holy Spirit comes down and fills the individual members of the Christian community who are around at the time, and they start speaking in tongues, and that might be considered a mystical experience, right? Direct union kind of thing is what's reported. Lurianic Kabbalah and Safat. So I've spelled it here Safed, but the name of the city in Hebrew is Tzfat. Safed is the anglicized Greek version of it. And we'll talk more about that, so I won't go into details there. Sufism has communal experiences of mystical union as well as gets reported. So we have a lot of religious traditions, particularly in the West, but also farther out. I just don't pretend to be particularly well versed in anything outside of Judaism, Christianity, a little bit of Islam, and a fair amount of Greco-Roman religion. But the perception of direct experience and apprehending the really real is kind of the marker of mystical experience. So there's a way of reading certain forms of Platonic philosophy that also are fairly mystical in the way that they explain things. So James Martin is a Catholic priest. He's a Jesuit priest who is fairly well known. And he says a mystical experience basically is one that makes us feel like a sudden flash of truth or light that releases you from your limited sense of self and gives you a taste of a reality that somehow feels more real. It doesn't mean seeing things or hearing things, but a new kind of being taken out of yourself or seeing things in a new way. And in my experience as a spiritual director, they are not, while common, also not uncommon. One young man told me he felt like he was a vase filled with water about to overflow. One woman told me that she looked around at Mass and suddenly realized that everyone had once been a child, right? So this is a very broad reading of what mysticism is. We might think of these as perhaps more like transcendent, people transcending themselves, maybe more than we would consider them mystical experiences, but you can see how broad the categories are sometimes drawn. So before we kind of move on to talking about the kinds of mysticism, are there questions about all of that? Because I know I do talk fast. And as always, you're welcome to type in the comment box if you come up with something as we go. Okay, so back to school. We'll talk about the different schools of Jewish mysticism. Not in huge amount of detail because you can start to parse things apart in very, very, very detailed ways. But this is kind of a rough outline, more or less in chronological order. Biblical mysticism, primarily the book of Ezekiel. Ma'aseh Breshit, works of creation. Ma'aseh Merkavah, works of the divine chariot. And Hechalot. Hechalot mysticism. Hechal is a Hebrew word that means palace or temple, depending on how it's used. And Hechalot means is mysticism focused on the makeup of the palace that God would occupy. That's the idea behind Hechalot mysticism. And then warnings about mystical speculation. So this is all happening in the first 10 centuries CE. Catalonian Sephardic Kabbalah, including the Zohar, now we're at like the 1200s. Lurianic Kabbalah, now we're in the late 1500s. Early modern traditional Kabbalah, so Lurianic Kabbalah keeps going and shows up in a number of other contexts in Jewish thought into the 17 and 1800s. Hasidic mysticism, because that takes its own direction, and we'll talk about what makes Hasidic mysticism a little different. And then modern traditional Kabbalah, there are still people who do Kabbalah in this sort of Lurianic model, who are doing it within what we would recognize as more established Jewish communal spaces. And then there are people who encounter it in kind of a New Age context as well, right? So this is, I didn't include them in Jewish mystical schools because most Jewish institutions would not really feel that organizations like the Kabbalah Center are really Jewish organizations. Is Catalonian? So Ami says, is Catalonian a reference to Ramban or Girona? Yes. And then the Zohar is actually not from Catalonia; it's from Castile. But and then Roberto says, would you not characterize the following of Shabbatai Tzvi as a mystical school? Absolutely. It is one of the permutations of what you'd call early modern traditional Kabbalah, because Shabbatai Tzvi emerges after 1648, 1649, which, depending on the Western historian you talk to, is when the modern period is considered to start. We won't delve deeply into Shabbatai Tzvi because the broader chunk of Jewish tradition ultimately says, well, he's not one of us. But the short story of Shabbatai Tzvi is he starts out as a Kabbalist, maybe doesn't take on a kind of messianic mantle to himself, says we're going to go march up to the Turkish Sultan and the world's going to change and everything's going to change, and instead he ends up being forced, or maybe not forced, to convert to Islam, and then his followers sometimes become Christians, and the following of Shabbatai Tzvi, once he's sort of done being a public leader, gets very complicated. And so at a certain point, they just stop being part of the Jewish community for the most part. There's no little layer of Jewish mysticism you can peel out that doesn't also peel out lots and lots and lots of other things, and you can go in lots of different directions, right? So there are books about Shabbatai Tzvi, of varying quality. So biblical mysticism, this is kind of our starting point, is not an organized or coherent set of ideas or texts. It's really basically Ezekiel 1, maybe a few other passages here and there, unless you count the apocalyptic visions of the book of Daniel as mystic traditions, in which case you pull those in as well. But the primary example, the thing that starts Jewish mystical speculation in any kind of organized way, as far as we can tell, is Ezekiel 1's description of the divine chariot, which is described as, quote, the appearance of the semblance of the glory or presence of the Lord. The Hebrew is mar'eh demut kavod. So there are not particularly exact ways to translate this, because mar'eh and demut are fairly close to each other in meaning. So if you've ever heard the Blind Faith song Presence of the Lord, that's where they got the phrase from, right? That Steve Winwood, Eric Clapton project from late 60s, early 70s. And Ezekiel describes seeing visions or appearances of God. So Ezekiel says God has a physical form that you can apprehend, or that at least he apprehended, and it's a very wild form. A four-faced head, and the ability to move in every direction at once. It's a very complicated passage that gives you the sense that Ezekiel is trying to describe something in words that he really can't articulate. This sort of thing, attempting to give an actual representation of a physical appearance of God, is really unusual in the Tanakh. Even Moses is described as having seen God, but only God's back, right? So there's this passage in Exodus 34 where Moses says, these Israelites are giving me such a pain in the neck. Prove that I'm really your chosen prophet. Please let me see you. And the response is, well, I can't let you do that because you die, but wedge yourself into that rock and I'll show you my back. And Moses doesn't see anything in particular, but the text reports that he hears a description of God and this wind rushes by. Ezekiel is really the only place where you get a physical description of what the God of Israel purports to look like. So this text in Ezekiel is very unusual for the entire Tanakh. So Catherine says psychotic hallucination. That is one hypothesis. There's been a fair amount of scholarly and a fair amount of not so scholarly work on trying to figure out more or less, quote unquote, what the heck is wrong with Ezekiel. And a lot of the speculation is that Ezekiel had some kind of psychiatric disorder, but we've got 50 chapters in Hebrew, not all of which were really written by him, so it's really hard to know whether there's some kind of psychiatric disorder or what. We don't really know, but we do have this unusual text that tries to give a physical description for something that really no other text in the Tanakh does. There are other texts in the Tanakh that give physical attributes. So Genesis 3 talks about God is walking around through the Garden of Eden and uses this verb hithalech, which is like perambulating or something. As it's usually translated, God is walking in the breeze of the day is the usual translation. But hithalech comes from halach, which is like to walk. So we get physical-ish descriptions of behavior, but we don't ever get this is what the God of Israel looks like, except Ezekiel kind of tries to say something like that. So that's biblical mysticism. So everything else builds in some way off of Ezekiel and then a handful of other texts. Rabbinic-Era mysticism, this is just a fudgy way of saying basically the 2nd century to the 10th century CE. Mystical speculation focuses on what the creation of the world was like, what the divine chariot is like, and what the palace that God would occupy, what that would look like. We have a number of these texts. They tend to be short. They don't represent a mainstream of rabbinic theology and of Jewish tradition of their time, but they exist in some forms. And mostly these texts are about describing the true nature of things. They don't focus quite as much on attempts to really change the nature of reality, but they are more descriptive. There's some amount of angelology, basically speculating on the names of the angels and what their names mean and what the job of that particular angel is. So Azarel and Metatron and some of these names that you've encountered before, there is a tradition of studying angels in Jewish mysticism. It's part of it. It gets more developed in Kabbalah, but it's there in this early stuff as well. There's a big focus on numerology. That's going to be characteristic of Jewish mysticism, period, end of sentence. A big focus on letters and mystical meanings. And for a lot of Jewish mysticism, reality is ultimately composed of letters and of text. So that's a thread that will run throughout, and we first see it in this kind of early post-biblical Jewish mysticism. This hechalot, so this creation is Maaseh Bereshit, chariot is Maaseh Merkava, and palaces is hechalot. This is where we first start to see really developed, really complex use of numbers and letters to try to draw out identities and ideas of what the mystics imagine God is. So this is where we start to see it. This is not present in Ezekiel. Ezekiel's just sort of having this wow experience and writing it down. This becomes a much more systematic set of practices. And I mentioned it's not the main tradition, it's kind of a counter tradition. We have rabbinic texts, mainstream rabbinic texts, that talk about mysticism, and they don't like it. So we have, this one on top is probably the one most people know. If they've heard anything about Jewish mysticism and what the rabbis thought of it, this is probably the text most people know. 4 entered Pardes. Pardes is not actually a Hebrew word. It's a Persian word that means garden or something like that. 4 entered Pardes, and this is maybe understood to be the Garden of Eden, but it's not really clear. 4 entered Pardes, and these are they: Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Acher, and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said to them, when you reach pure marble stones, do not say water, water, because it is stated, one who speaks lies will not be established before my eyes. I'm going to answer your question up front. No one knows what this actually means. The hypothesis is you'll reach pure marble stones and they'll be so pure that you'll mistake what they are. So don't call them water. But there's really not any clarity on what's happening. And then the text says, Ben Azai glimpsed and died, and concerning him, Scripture says, dear in the eyes of the Lord is the death of his righteous ones. What does that mean? We're not sure. Ben Zoma glimpsed and was harmed. This is traditionally understood to mean Ben Zoma glimpsed Pardes and went insane. That's the understanding. And concerning him, Scripture says, have you found honey? Eat enough for yourself, lest you become sated from it and vomit it. So essentially, this is Ben Zoma saw more than he could absorb, and it drove him mad. Acher cut down what was planted. So Acher is this guy, Elisha ben Avuya, who is understood in the Talmud to be a heretic, somebody who is trained as a rabbi, is ordained as a rabbi, and has an experience that undoes his view of the rabbis as being correct. And so cut down what was planted is he had a mystical experience, and that's what drove him to become a heretic. And only Rabbi Akiva came out whole. So this is most people can't handle mysticism, don't do it. This is what this text is generally understood to be saying. There's this other text which isn't obviously about mysticism until you start to study other mystical texts. Rabbi Yonah said in the name of Rabbi Levi, why was the world created with a bet? Meaning, why does the Torah start with a bet? Wouldn't you start it with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, an aleph? Why was the world created with a bet? What is a bet? It's closed on all sides and open in the front. You are not permitted to say what was below it, what was above it, what was in front of it, what was after it, except from the day the world was created and thereafter. So one version of Jewish mysticism is called Ma'aseh Bereshit, study of the deeds of creation. And this is a text saying you're not supposed to ask those questions. So this text is saying don't ask that stuff. Bar Kappara said, but ask concerning the beginning days that were before you. In other words, he says there's another verse that you could maybe interpret to mean you can ask that. And he says, no. From when things were created, you can inquire it, not after. So we're getting these texts that say, don't look too deeply into certain things. It's bad for you to look. It's justifiably confusing. So an example is, I'll hold it up because some of this stuff I have hanging around. This is Sefer Yetzirah. This is an English translation of it. Sefer Yetzirah is about 1,400 words in Hebrew, not long. The translation is this thick because you can't understand anything that's in it without significant commentary. This version of it is about 400 pages long. And so Sefer Yetzirah, these are just selections from it so you can see what you're dealing with in terms of what mystical texts look like if you've never looked at them before. With 32 mystical paths of wisdom engraved, Yah, the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, the living God, King of the universe, El Shaddai, merciful and gracious, high and exalted, dwelling in eternity, whose name is holy. He is lofty and holy, and he created his universe with 3 books, Sepharim, with texts, Sefer, and number, Sephar, and with communication, Sipur. So this is a pun. For those who don't know Hebrew, F and P are effectively the same letter in Hebrew. So the universe is created with 32 mystical paths of wisdom. These correspond to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and then 10 numbers 0 through 9, which are considered to be also the next one, 10 sefirot of nothingness, and 22 foundation letters, 3 mothers, 7 doubles, and 12 elementals. If you know what's going on here, raise your hand. I can't see if you're raising your hand. I'm going to assume there aren't a lot of hands raised. I guess you could raise your Zoom hand too, right? This is talking about the Hebrew alphabet and the function of specific letters, which you don't know what the letters are unless I tell you what they are, right? The 3 mothers are actually Aleph, Mem, and Shin, so right the first and the middle and almost the end, but not quite the end of the alphabet. 7 doubles, 12 elementals. There's all kinds of stuff going on here that the letters have specific meanings that in combinations have specific meanings and form different names of God, right? But you don't know that just by looking at this, right? You have to have people tell you what it actually means. A little farther down, right? So this was the first chunk of text. This is the second chunk of text. It's already very confusing and it's not clear what it means. And then it says the 22 foundation letters. Now we're a whole chapter in. He placed them in a circle like a wall with 231 gates. The circle oscillates back and forth. A sign for this is, there is nothing in good higher than delight, oneg. There is nothing evil lower than plague, nega. And you should know that oneg, spelled backwards. If you juggle the letters around, of oneg you get nega, right? So there's another pun happening. But where'd the 231 gates come from? Right, we kind of have to assume they know what they're talking about. So, as I said, this is 1,400 words in Hebrew, and the translation's like this. So, here is, we looked at 1-1. This is the Hebrew for 1-1. This is the translation of it into verse. And then I have about 20 pages worth of text explaining all of these individual things in order to be able to even begin to understand what's happening here. And that's pretty much how every Kabbalistic text you ever find in English translation has to be presented, because you have no idea what's going on unless they tell you. So this is what a Kabbalistic text, this is an early one, so this is sort of the tail end of pre-Zohar Jewish mysticism. This is what these texts look like. In Hebrew, they don't make any better sense. So this is kind of what mystical texts are like in early Jewish tradition, early Jewish mystical traditions, and you are entitled to say, wait, what did any of that mean? I can't 100% tell you either. So the 10 Sefirot that it was talking about, you may have seen this kind of diagram before. You may have seen this kind of put into the shape of a human figure as well. But these are there's a book by Gershom Scholem, who is a major scholar of Jewish mysticism from the 20th century, on the mystical shape of the Godhead. This is the Godhead, different aspects of the way mysticism, the way Kabbalah understood different aspects of God and how they were in balance and their different functions. And this bottom level is kind of the one that's closest to the created world as they see it. So that's what it's talking about when it says 10 Sefirot. It's intentionally complex. What does any of this mean? What's this 231 gates thing? So if you take the 22 Hebrew letters and you put them in a circle and you draw lines from every other letter, you end up with 231 lines. And that's the formula for calculating how many lines you get if you take n number of letters and put them in a circle. Why do this? It's a meditative exercise. So traditionally what would happen is people who were inducted into these mysteries would sit on the ground and would draw a circle with the Hebrew letters and then would draw the lines out as they were meditating. So it's a meditative exercise. It's intended to describe the ingredients of creation and to guide meditation and ultimately, supposedly, the creation of a golem, which nobody ever did, despite what the stories say. Catherine says, sounds like a mandala. Yeah, right. So it's not too dissimilar from a mandala or something like that, right? A physical thing that you're doing that engages, that lets you turn parts of your brain off and on to have a different kind of experience, right? So that's what the wheel is, and that's what the wheel looks like. Jack, I see you've got a digital hand up.
I guess I've got a let's step back for a second
Sure.
kind of question. Um, I think you labeled this rabbinic period mysticism as a counter tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Um, was it, uh, uh, did it arise out of a kind of reaction to the legalism, scholasticism, so to speak, of what I'll call mainstream rabbis? I mean, it's sort of puzzling to me where this comes from. It's much easier for me to understand Christian mysticism because, after all, the core of the religion is an encounter with God incarnate.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that's not, except for Moses, much about what Judaism was. So where does this come from? What's the source of this?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and it's very hard to answer because the reality is we don't have nearly as many Jewish texts from this time period as we do Christian texts. It is likely that there is always some kind of mysticism happening. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which, okay, I know there are people who find them fascinating. I took a whole seminar in them and I thought they were a snooze. Very disappointing. 1 out of 10 would not recommend, right? There's an apocalyptic and mystical tradition happening there. And I suspect that a lot of what's happening in this approach to Jewish mysticism is not so much a reaction against the scholasticism of rabbinic tradition, but reflects growing dependence upon text in Jewish tradition. Because the letters themselves are significant, and you can't do this kind of mysticism unless you can read and write. So you have to be literate. So in all likelihood, I suspect what's happening is that we're getting these pre-existing mystical traditions, and they're getting paired up with a more rabbinically aligned midrashic textual thing, and they're creating a new kind of a new theological counter tradition. So it is, in some respects, it is in contrast to traditional Jewish theology, quote unquote theology, in the rabbinic text. in the rabbis, because that focuses on doing things. And this is not about doing things. This is about working with text and letters, which is not unique to Judaism either, because we have incantation bowls from Persia. So this is a syncretistic practice, right? There's a complicated story here, and we don't know all of it because we're getting these little glimpses in from what few texts are preserved. And so it becomes a very difficult line to draw, to say, oh, it clearly develops from these 5 sources and moves forward. There's just a big blank, and this is the stuff that doesn't make it into the Talmud and doesn't make it into the letters that major rabbis send back and forth to communities, because they don't want to talk about this. So it's hard to know. Joyce.
Yeah, I was wondering, when you had that diagram of the 10 Sifirot, why there were 11 circles.
One. So we've got 6. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. This top one, Keter, is actually not one of the Sefirot exactly. Oh. So we'll see Keter show up again, but Keter in Hebrew means crown. This is sort of understood by the Kabbalists to be God before there was any hint of anything being created. So this is God as another name that they will use is Ein Sof, which means infinite. Ein Sof means no end. So this is understood to be God completely abstracted away and completely unified and completely infinite all at once.
Okay.
So
not part of the other 10.
Not part of the other ones, but you can't do the diagram without. Right. What this is showing is a series of what are called emanations. We'll talk about what emanations are, because we won't talk too much about what emanations are, but we'll talk about it when we get to it, because it's another concept that you have to have in the background to understand just the basics of what they're thinking.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so back to the math, or the numerology and letterology. So this is when it's talking about the 231 gates. These are the 231 gates, and in the background here, these are also the 231 gates. So each of these lines, so there's a line that goes from Aleph to Bet, and from Bet to Gimel, and Gimel to Daled, and you can see they're built in pairs here in this matrix down below. Each of these is understood to be a name of God. And so some mystical practices would have you recite these. Some of them would have you envision them while reciting certain established prayers. Right? There's all kinds of different approaches to it. And they are understood as they're thought about or uttered, they have different effects out in the world. And you can see from this matrix that the middle row, the 11th row, is L, 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 right? So these all mean God. That's kind of what they understand is happening here, is that these are all specific names of God, that because the world is created through speech, each of these combinations has different kinds of power to affect the world and to affect you, and to affect people and the universe and all of everything. That's sort of an underlying current to all of this, that you have to start to see how this stuff gets put together to understand a little bit about what they're trying to do and what they think is happening out there in the world. And it is very confusing, and for people who are inclined toward rationalism, as many humanistic Jews are, this just seems irrational. And so we can talk about it and describe it, but internalizing it is not a thing that many of us are even inclined to be able to do, let alone go further with it. Because if I tell you these are all names of God, you're entitled to look at me like I've got three heads. Because these are just pairs of letters, what do you mean? Right? We just don't share those assumptions with the people who wrote Sefer Yetzirah in this case. And I should say Sefer Yetzirah, Yetzirah means creation or formation. So this is the book of creation. And ultimately, if you master the secrets in Sefer Yetzirah, you are supposed to be capable of creating a golem, right? The clay figure that you can then animate into life, right? Because if God used words to create the world and you use the same words, you can affect the same result. That's happening in the background here. It's never fully mentioned in these texts, but it's what's happening in the background. Who's confused? Raise your hand. Who is totally on board with, yeah, this all makes sense. I know how to do this. I'm going to go home and create well, you're probably home. I'm going to go create a golem tonight. I don't plan on doing it. This seems strange. And so if you've watched The Simpsons, you know there's an episode where a Zen master says to Bart, "What's the sound of one hand clapping?" And he goes, "Easy, man." Right? If a tree falls in the woods and no one is there to hear it, does it still make a sound? We say this stuff, and we do it in very frequently in the manner of making fun of what these are. What these are called koan, or puzzles. It's a puzzle. The point isn't answering the question. The answer to the question, what's the sound of one hand clapping, is not that. You're not supposed to answer the question. It instead is supposed to point your contemplation and your thoughts in particular directions. And the question is there to do that. It's not there to be answered correctly. So this stuff is in the same vein. The idea here is not you memorize all of these pairs and somehow memorizing all of those pairs gets you the power to create a golem. The idea is instead you memorize these pairs and you meditate, and it starts to shape your thinking and your experience of your own thoughts. So they are meditative exercises. They are not magic words all on their own. We sometimes see charts of letters and go, oh, they're magic words. That's not what is actually supposed to be happening here. And we'll look at some texts about Kabbalistic experience so you can kind of understand what Kabbalists thought was happening. And that's the point of the 231 gates, is not the figure that you create at the end. It's the contemplation, the reciting, the repetition, the self-mystification that then affects thought patterns. So before we move on to the next step, are there questions that I can answer? I'm sure you got questions I can't answer.
Yeah, I have one question. With those two pair combinations, of course, there are no vowels. I mean, do people just make up how to say them?
Do people make up how to say them? So sometimes they're not said. Sometimes they are memorized and meditated upon. However, something we've left out of this is defining the word Kabbalah. So we should do that now. Kabbalah literally means tradition. So how do you know how these are supposed to sound? You're not supposed to do this without a teacher who's passing on, who's handing you the tradition that you then accept. So Kabbalah means tradition, but it means that a thing that you've received or accepted. So you can't do this really without an effective teacher. That's the tradition, that's Jewish tradition's understanding of how this all works, is you need somebody who knows this and has lived through this and has done this over and over and over and over again. Otherwise, you can't possibly learn how to do this. So I can read this book and I can read all the comments to try to begin to start to understand what they're talking about, but it won't get me very far, is the idea, that you need a teacher. And without an effective teacher, none of this is actually meaningful. So you need the tradition to even know what the tradition means, right? It's part of why, that's part of why this is a counter tradition within Jewish thought for so long, is because there's no way of just conveying this in print, and you can't even bundle it with a commentary and make it make sense. You can't even stick two people and have them discussing on what's happening here. It's of a different sort of character than other rabbinic texts. So you need the person passing the tradition on, otherwise it doesn't work. So traditional Kabbalah arises during the late Jewish Golden Age in Spain, so 1100s, 1200s, among Jews who had Greek philosophical materials preserved and transmitted by Muslim scholars. Sefer Yetzirah bridges pre-Kabbalistic and Kabbalistic forms. This is autocorrect stepping in, but these are related words. Sefer Yetzirah is sort of a chronological bridge. It's from the 11th century, so it's bridging the earliest Jewish mysticism with what becomes classic Kabbalistic mysticism. And what eventually happens is we go from this, which has these very perfunctory short statements and is all of 1,400 words in Hebrew, to this, the Zohar, of which I'm holding only volume 1. And in Hebrew, or really in Aramaic, is 10 volumes long. The English translation of the version that I'm holding is more than 25 volumes. And again, there's text on the top of the page that's the actual text, and then there's commentary below, and you can't understand this without that. So it's theosophical. The people who do medieval Kabbalah don't just know mystical texts, and they don't just know rabbinic texts. They do know Greek philosophy. And so I actually mentioned Neoplatonism's already quasi-mystical understanding of the creation of the universe. Neoplatonism dates from the 2nd century CE. Without Neoplatonism, you in fact don't have the doctrine of the Trinity in Christianity, and you don't have Kabbalah, as we will come to see it. So Neoplatonism holds that before anything existed, there was just this one infinite but inherently unified being that is God, and God contemplates God's self and emanates out another God, but it's the same God. And that God contemplates and emanates out another God, but it's really the same God. This is starting to sound like Trinitarian theology, because it is. And then eventually one of these gods contemplates and creates the universe, the physical universe we know, but it's never perfect. It's inherently flawed. So this is what's happening in Neoplatonism, and that's the model that comes into Christianity through the idea of the Trinity, and it's what comes into Jewish thought through Kabbalah. And what's different is the number of gods, many gods essentially created through contemplation. In Christianity, it's 3. But you don't get Kabbalah without Greek philosophy. And I say this because very often what happens is Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, is counterposed as the alternative to Jewish rationalism a la Maimonides. And that is a bad dichotomy because, in fact, they're all reading some of the same stuff. And Maimonides, early in his career, was a mystic, and pre-Zohar mystics read Maimonides and thought he had good things to say. So we can't, sometimes this is presented as the dominant ways of thinking about theology among Jews in the medieval period were either rationalist or this wacky Kabbalistic experiential stuff. They're not that different. So this traditional Kabbalah, I have traditional in quotes because Kabbalah means tradition, and at a certain point this gets redundant. Traditional Kabbalah becomes the dominant form of Jewish mysticism in the 10th or 11th century. We start to lose people doing this, what does the divine palace look like stuff in their heads, and we start to get this Greek-influenced way of looking at mystical thought. France, Germany, and Spain, and serves as a counterpoint to these rationalist strains in Judaism, right? We treat it as like they're two different things, but it's people fighting over sometimes their distinctions without a difference. That these are very close conceptually in a lot of ways in their very fundamentals. So for those who attended the Maimonides, the Guide of the Perplexed course that I did, I actually mentioned that Maimonides says, I'm not sure how this all works. It's kind of puzzling. Well, Maimonides has a mystical element to him, even as a rationalist. So there's a recognized limit to cognition happening in Jewish tradition, and the question is, how much do you think you can really think about and know? And that's the distinction. None of it happens without Greek philosophy. So we're moving into traditional Kabbalah. And the peak of traditional Kabbalah is this book, the Zohar. This is where it gets its most refined and consolidated form. No Jewish mysticism that happens after the Zohar functions without really being worked through the Zohar, and at it, most post-Zohar mystics will try to tell you how what they say is really already in the Zohar, and I'm not making anything up. They're making things up. But they'll tell you they're not making anything up. See, it's in the Zohar. So the Zohar means splendor or radiance. It seems when you open it up, it's not the same as prior mystical books. These prior mystical books have these weird, very clipped statements, 22 22 letters and 10 sefirot and 231 gates, right? We saw some of this. The Zohar doesn't look like that. The Zohar looks like a rabbinic commentary. Sticks in a verse of biblical verse and seems to be talking about it. But it doesn't actually explain the verses, which is what most commentaries try to do. It instead starts to just kind of go off and tell stories, and it's not at all, it's very different from those earlier commentary works. Why is it called the Zohar? Why is it called Radiance? Early in the work, the word Zohar is used repeatedly to describe aspects of the act of creation. So it understands moments in the creation of the world as flashes of color or of light or of radiance or of sound. And each of these moments starts with Zohar in Hebrew. Most modern scholars say that this was written by Moses de Leon, who lived in Avila in the mid to late 1200s. De Leon, for his part, says, I found this book. No one had ever seen this book before. I found this book, and it was written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was a student of Rabbi Akiva from the 2nd century, and it was lost, and I found it. Shimon Bar Yochai lived in the Middle East. I don't know how this book gets to Castile and how it's then buried for 1,000 years until Moses de Leon finds it. Most modern scholars say maybe some of the stuff in here came from Shimon Bar Yochai, but really Moses de Leon's hand is very prominent in it. It is not written in Hebrew, it is written in Aramaic. And it is written in a very cryptic form of Aramaic, and linguists who've studied it have said the person who wrote this did not use Aramaic as a language of their life. That this reflects somebody who read things in Aramaic and tried to write Aramaic themselves. And so the Aramaic is very strange, and it's very hard to understand, and uses very strange vocabulary, and it mentions things that could not have happened until the 5th century and the 10th century and whatever else, giving support to the idea that this is not today. If it were written by Shimon Bar Yochai, this would be a 1900-year-old document. The language and the history suggest that that's not true. Most modern scholars will tell you this thing dates from the 1200s. In the world of Orthodox Judaism, people might say, okay, so maybe he had a hand in kind of shaping it, but this is as true as the Torah, and it's as true as the Talmud. So the Zohar occupies a huge place in the modern world of Orthodox Jews. A little bit from the Zohar, you can see how it's different. This is what comes right after the very first verse of the Torah. So it says, in the beginning, we get the first word, and it says, at the head of the potency of the king, he engraved engravings in luster on high. A spark of impenetrable darkness flashed within the concealed of the concealed, and from the head of infinity a cluster of vapor forming in formlessness, thrust in a ring, not white, not black, not red, not green, no color at all. As a cord surveyed, it yielded radiant colors. We don't have colors, but we have colors. We have form, but formlessness. As a cord surveyed, it yielded radiant colors. Deep within the spark gushed a flow, splaying colors below, concealed within them, concealed of the mystery of the Ein Sof. It split and did not split its aura, was not known at all, until under the impact of splitting, a single concealed supernate point shone. Beyond that point, nothing is known. It is the so-called Reshit, beginning, first command of all. So it's almost word salad for us to look at it. Engravings in luster on high, impenetrable darkness, but light flashes in impenetrable darkness. It's a spark of darkness. From the head of infinity, there's no colors, but there's colors. And a flow gushes, and colors are sprayed below, and concealed within it is the mystery of the Ein Sof, but light reveals, right? So this is a really difficult text to parse. This is what the whole Zohar is like. And so another line down, the enlightened will shine like Zohar. This is where we're getting the word Zohar from. Radiance of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. So now we've pulled the book of Daniel to flesh out what we're talking about in Genesis. And we get the first Zohar radiance. Concealed of concealed struck its aura, which touched and did not touch this point, right? Touching and not touching. Concealed of concealed. Then this beginning expanded, building itself a palace worthy of glorious praise. There it sowed seed to give birth, availing words. The secret is, her stock is a seed of holiness. And we keep going like this. And so we'll see Zohar radiance, and then there's another description of something that happens in the creation of the world, and Zohar radiance in another description, right? So this is where the Zohar is getting its name. But you can see that this is a text that in the beginning is pulling out and pulling out and pulling out description that is nowhere in the text. It's just not there in the biblical text. It's not even there if you go look in the Midrash. So this is very complicated, hard to understand stuff. Jack.
Is this meant to be like a koan, like the sound of one hand clapping. That is to say, people are not supposed to understand it, but it is supposed, the contemplation of it, the thinking about it, the reading of it is supposed to somehow form one's engagement with the world or reality or the Godhead.
To some extent, that's what's happening, but this is also people actually thinking that they're describing what's happened. And it's part of the word salidiness, right? This, like, there's just words and they don't match up, or they contradict themselves immediately. Part of it is the koan aspect of it, but part of it is also, I'm trying to explain to you something I cannot possibly explain to you, except that you have the experience yourself, and then you'll understand what I mean. So they did think that if you contemplated, you would see the same things as were in the Zohar, and you would understand how something could split and not split its aura, or how something could touch and not touch. You'd get it. So Greg says, split and not split, touched and not touched, like an early attempt at characterizing quantum physics, right? If you've heard of Schrodinger's cat, the Schrodinger's cat thing is actually a thought experiment intended to disprove the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. So the Heisenberg uncertainty principle says, until you observe a thing, you don't know whether it's A or B, in a very rough way of describing it. And Schrodinger says, great, stick a cat in a box. Is the cat alive or dead? You don't know until you open the box. To point out, of course the cat's either alive or dead. You don't need to open the box to know. So, yeah, this has a very kind of, it feels like that. And it will thus not surprise you to know that one of the things that the Lubavitchers got up to, because Lubavitch Hasidism is an heir to Kabbalistic thought, one of the things that the Lubavitcher Rebbe got up to was having volumes published where Jewish theoretical physicists and quantum physicists would compare what they were doing to Kabbalah. It's harder to find those books these days because they don't publish them as much, but the Lubavitcher Rebbe thought of himself as a scientist. He was trained as an engineer in France, and so he was very into getting Jewish physicists to show how Kabbalah and physics were very comparable. So, yeah, the terminology, you'll get it. Once you study it enough, you'll get it. That's kind of what's happening. And you're entitled to say, seriously, this is Meshuggah. For those not conversant in Yiddish, Meshuggah is the Yiddish word that means crazy. You're fair to think that what we're looking at is crazy because it seems that way. How can something touch and not touch? But we can start to piece apart some of what's happening in the text. So these are our Sefirot and Keter, Ein Sof for the infinite. We saw this head of the potency of the king. Okay, so when we have God infinite and inherently unified and tied together and infinitely dense and infinitely large and all of these other things, engraved engravings on high, is working from Ezekiel. So we can see what creation would look like, but it's not describable. It split and did not split its aura. Concealed of concealed struck its aura. Right? This is from the comments, the modern comments, written by Daniel Matt, who is the translator of this edition of the Zohar. He says, here the blinding spark, the head of the potency of the king, the spark is the first impulse of emanation flashing from Ein Sof through Keter and proceeding to delineate the various Sefirot. The goal of meditation is to attain this spark and participate in the primal flow of being. This is supposed to guide your meditation so that you can absorb into this thing experientially. That's what's happening here. And rather than try to piece this apart, because we're not going to be able to do it, let's look at what Kabbalists say happens to them, because that's a way of into understanding how they're experiencing all of this. They trying to self-transcend and achieve unity with the divine. This isn't really all that different from what meditative traditions and what meditative practices and other traditions do, but it's different from what the rabbis said the point of keeping the commandments is and what the purpose of prayer is in mainstream Judaism, which largely boils down to you do this because God said so. There is no other goal that you're trying to achieve this way. But the seeming connect-in to universal phenomena makes Kabbalah attractive to Christianity and gets it opposed within Judaism. But this is the goal, is this kind of transcendence and unification with the divine, right? The goal of meditation is to attain the spark and participate in the primal flow of being, right? You're coming outside of yourself and you are absorbing into the flow of light, this infinite, imperceptible flow of light that can't be light, that touches and doesn't touch, right? That's the goal here. That's not me saying it, it's Daniel Mack commenting on the Zohar. So, why engage in this? Jewish life was hard. And so, Kabbalah and apocalypticism are all in part ways of kind of stepping outside of the world that you are in. Because the world you are in is bad, and the Zohar talks about Jews being persecuted. So this is an actual mystical experience. The narrative of what Abraham Abulafia claims was an actual mystical experience. And Abulafia is one of these guys who was reading Maimonides before he became a mystic. So he pulls Maimonides together in some of his writings. And Abulafia says, prepare to meet, this is how you do it. Prepare to meet your God, prepare to devote your heart, purify your body, select a special place where no one can hear you, be alone. This is called hitbodedut, self-isolation. Wrap yourself in talis and tefillin and put on clean garments and take hold of ink and pen and tablet, and you're about to serve your God, and just combine letters, right? We saw that matrix of letters. Just combine letters, a few or many, revolving them rapidly until your mind warms up, and when you feel your mind is warm and that through the combinations you understand new things you have not attained by human tradition or discovered on your own through mental reflection, i.e. you've combined the letters and combined the letters and combined the letters, and there's now, like, as Abulafia understands it, you're getting stuff beamed into your head from heaven, effectively. Now turn your thoughts to visualizing the name and its supernal angels. So now you're thinking about the divine names, imagining them as if they were human beings standing or sitting around you. Prepare your mind and heart to understand many things about to be conveyed to you by the letters being contemplated within you. Meditate them as a whole and in all their detail. All this will happen after you fling the tablet from your hands and the pen, or after they fall by themselves due to the intensity of your thoughts. So the writing and the contemplation is intended to work yourself into a kind of ecstasy, in the sense of stepping outside of yourself, ecstasis. Realizing that the stronger the mental flow, the weaker your organs and limbs will become, and your body will begin to tremble violently. Choose death over life, knowing that death affects only the body and the soul lives eternally, and then you will know you are capable of receiving the flow. And then when you're done, when you're ready to plotz, when you're ready to burst, you return to the physical dimension, rise, eat and drink a little, inhale a fragrant aroma, return your spirit to its sheath until another time, rejoice in what you have done, and know that God loves you. This is Abulafia telling students, this is how you do it. This is what the experience is like. The point of studying the Zohar, the point of studying all of these things, the point of combining the letters and thinking through them and writing them and drawing these diagrams and all of these other things is to pull you into a state like the one described here. That's what's supposed to be happening, according to Abraham Abulafia. That's what the experience is supposed to be like. And that's what they say is happening when you have this experience where you work yourself into this kind of physical state. This is when you know you're directly encountering the divine, and it's like the thread going from you to it. That's what is said to be happening here. And this is how you do it. By yourself, writing, right? So we're seeing the combined letters, just combine letters, keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it. And eventually you work yourself to the state. Or you don't, I guess. The text didn't go on to say what happens if it doesn't work. Very quickly, rise, eat, and drink a little, and inhale a fragrant aroma. Sound like Havdalah? Right? Havdalah, and part of Havdalah is fire, smelling some spices. And here we are. Because the Kabbalists invented Havdalah as we know it. So you can see the lines from what a lot of people do today to mysticism. You can see the line forming already. So despite the fact that this text says be alone, it only wants you to be alone for the time that you're engaged in this activity. Jewish mystical practice is not ascetic. Be fruitful and multiply is viewed as a commandment, and Jewish mystical practices are often sexually charged. God is viewed as having masculine and feminine attributes. Shabbat is seen as feminine. Israel's relationship with God is characterized in female, male, wife, husband terms. Hitbodedut, this word that means solitude, is not supposed to be permanent. Jewish mystics don't become hermits. And I say with one very prominent exception, the Vilna Gaon, who lived in the mid to late 1700s, does actually kind of engage in some hermetic kinds of things, but at the same time he's writing Talmud commentaries and he has kids. So he's a very outlying kind of case, that you can only be the outlier like him because you're an outlier in every other respect in your life. And a recent biography of him is titled, a recent biography of him by a modern scholar, Eliyahu Stern, is titled The Genius. So the Vilna Gaon's a very different person from all of the other mystics. It's not about escape from the world as a whole, right? The mystic doesn't go into, Jewish mystics don't go into solitude for forever, but they're supposed to serve to enhance traditional Jewish practices. And it's not about escape from the world as a whole, because some variations of Kabbalah include reincarnation. The idea that you'll go through a few cycles, Gilgul. You'll go through a few cycles of being alive and dead. So this is not Christian mysticism that tends to be very monk-like. This is something different. This is an add-on to traditional Jewish life, and it's sort of behavior focus for most mystics. And it doesn't view the world as irretrievably bad, which is why Kabbalah is not Christianity. So this is also from the Essential Kabbalah, which is, again, Daniel Matt is the main translator in the modern period of many of these Kabbalistic works. And he says, look, he has from Naftali Bacharach, the world could be created only by virtue of the act of the righteous, the arousal of those below. Christianity thinks that the world is irredeemably broken. Kabbalists say it's only because of the righteous that there is a world. God contemplated the good deeds of the righteous, and this act of thinking was enough to actualize the thought, drew forth light, and delighted with holy people, and that's what created the ability for God, who's supposed to be all-powerful, but it's only because of righteous people that the power to create even existed. The irony is that there is Christian Kabbalah, where Kabbalistic texts are pulled in by Christian mystics and theologians and said to prove that the Trinity is true and all kinds of other things. And Kabbalah appeals to New Age practitioners too. So you can see there's a lot happening, and it's a lot unclear because they're really writing things to try to attempt to describe a thing that can't, for them, really be described. many of us, our tendency is to say they're having some kind of crisis or break or something, right? That's not what they think is happening to them. Breaking a few eggs. So if you've encountered Jewish mysticism, you've probably really encountered Lurianic Kabbalah. So you haven't encountered pure Zohar or whatever it is. You've encountered Jewish mysticism as processed through the work of Isaac Luria and his students, who really, Luria makes it barely 40 years, right? He doesn't even make it to 40, right? 1534 to 1572. He lays out a completely new approach to understanding Kabbalah, and a big part of his approach is to say, you know, the world has some corruption to it. Here's exactly how it worked. The Zohar is not as clear as what Luria's students write, and Luria's version of this is that God occupies everything and is infinite and is inherently unified, and retracts a little bit, contracts, and this is called Tzimtzum, in order to allow other things to exist and be created. And the created universe is composed of vessels, and the infinite version of God emanates light into these vessels, but they can't hold the light and they break. And it's the breaking that allows evil to enter the world. So the initial version of creation actually was not evil at all. And the state of the world can be restored to perfection by tikkun, repair, which is accomplished by mystical practices and by following the Torah. That's the Lurianic Kabbalah version of how this all works and how you fix the world. And if you've heard the phrase tikkun olam, this is where it's from. Right, this is what happened, the way we get to tikkun olam as we understand it today, repairing the world, fixing things, social justice, all of that stuff, is modern Jewish activists in the 1970s really were looking for a way to describe what they were doing, which they thought of as not really fitting into the category of tzedakah, which is right charity, or gemilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness. They're like, no, we understand these categories. These are mostly about kind of bridging people along when they're not doing well. We want to remake the world. We want to fix it. That's really tikkun ha'olam, repairing the world. And they find this term tikkun in mystical texts, and they say that's what we're trying to do. So that's where the term, as we tend to use it today, right? At one point, the Machar Social Action Committee was called the Tikkun Olam Committee. We did it too, right? That's where this is really coming from. This term is from this period in the 1970s where people were sort of neo-Hasidic and were re-encountering mystical texts, but from a very politically liberal perspective, and trying to infuse it with religious dynamic, and this is how they did it. In the Jewish world, it's calling it tikkun olam, and now everybody uses the word, mostly without knowing that this is where it's from. Is Lurianic Kabbalah's version of you fix it by following commandments, and that gradually fixes the world because the world was broken, and we put the sparks back together. That's where this concept, as we use it today, comes from. So this is another one of those, okay, we have Havdalah, and we have Tikkun Olam. These are things coming out of, specifically, Lurianic Kabbalah, this version of Kabbalah that comes up in the late 1500s. Kabbalah emerges in Tzfat, as does a crucial work of Jewish law, the Shulchan Aruch, which becomes really probably the most important work of Jewish law after the Talmud, because unlike Maimonides' Code of Jewish Law, this is the one that everybody starts from in the Orthodox world. There's no coincidence that these two things come from the same place. Tzfat has its own printing press. Joseph Caro is himself a Kabbalist. The writer of the Shulchan Aruch is a Kabbalist himself. They come out of the same printing press at basically the same time and appear when the rest of the Jewish world is unstable and doesn't have its own printing press. So if you look at the rest of the world at this time and what Jews are doing in it, the Inquisition has started in Spain in earnest. Jews are fleeing Spain, they're fleeing Portugal, they are fleeing into North Africa, they're fleeing into Eastern Europe, they're fleeing into Holland. What they are not is established and stable, except in Tzfat, where they are very established and very stable, and they can start to print their own stuff and propagate it out through the Jewish world, because the major Jewish printing presses at the time elsewhere were in Italy, where Jews were being locked into ghettos. So there's this historical moment where Lurianic Kabbalists are actually able to distribute their stuff throughout the world, and they're able to distribute both Kabbalistic thought and mainstream Jewish work that they've produced. And this is how Kabbalah starts to get everywhere. Get yourself a printing press and a pretty stable situation for yourself, and you can get your ideas out there. And so they produce a Siddur, and they produce works on Kabbalistic practices, and they develop their own practices. And this is where Kabbalat Shabbat comes from. It's not a coincidence that it's called Kabbalat Shabbat. Kabbalah is right there in the name. So the things that are very commonly done, Friday night Shabbat services, people didn't used to do this. They did it at home. They wouldn't go to the synagogue, or if they did, they ran through the prayers and they went home, and there wasn't Lachad Odi, and there wasn't singing Shalom Aleichem, and there wasn't Havdalah that you did at the synagogue, and it had the candle, and it had the cup of wine, and all this other stuff. They reworked Judaism in some very profound ways. And even in the humanistic Jewish world, we do stuff because of what they reworked. And the Nusach Ari, this is the liturgy, the Siddur that the Ari, this is, the Ari is another name for Isaac Luria. The Ari puts together a prayer book, and it propagates out. And the Nusach Ari is the prayer book you get if you're a Chabadnik, because that's what they use. So this version of things, the Tikkun Olam, we own the printing press, we have the Halacha stuff that we can publish to, we have the Siddur, we're doing this stuff on Friday night, we're doing this stuff on Havdalah that people didn't do before, shapes everything about Jewish life afterward. Hasidic Judaism is essentially taking Lurianic Kabbalah and teaching it to regular Jews. That was the original premise of Hasidic Judaism, was too much yeshiva, we're going to give you a spiritual practice. Boom. And so that's what Hasidic Judaism starts as. So everyday Hasidic Judaism is in fact essentially mysticism. Musar, which is this ethical discipline, is almost all of it is written by Lurianic Kabbalists. So they very much understand the process of becoming a better person as being essentially a mystical practice as well. It involves meditations and mantra and recitations and sitting in darkened rooms, and there's all kinds of things that go with Musar, which seems like a benign ethical tradition, that are really Jewish mysticism. Liberal Jewish life, right? We talked about Tikkun Olam and using liturgical pieces like Lachad Odi and Havdalah. And then religious Zionism, right? The kind of Zionism, Naftali Bennett's version of Zionism, is also itself rooted in Lurianic Kabbalah through the work of Rabbi Isaac Kook. Early 1900s, was a Kabbalistic Orthodox rabbi who said that part of Tikkun Olam, in the traditional sense of putting the sparks back together, is Jews going back to the land of Israel. So that religious Zionism has a very, very intense strand of mysticism in it. So that modern Judaism, in most of its forms, is incredibly indebted to Jewish mysticism as we inherited it.